Well, welcome back everyone to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. We're going to resume our discussions with Will Howard in this session, and you'll remember that Will is an outstanding climate scientist. His PhD gave him the initial background in this, but since then, just an amazing length of experience and depth in professional application of these things in working in government policy and in looking at the practical research and studies to really understand what's going on out there. So, we're very fortunate to have him with us for this conversation. And we talked last time about the general context of all of this. What is the theory and science of climate change? How is it actually affecting the planet from the point of view of the environment itself? And so, with that background now, we're going to dive more deeply into the issue of the disaster effects of climate change. What sort of dynamics does this syndrome affect in relation to the behaviour patterns of the weather and the firestorms that we've been experiencing? Can we blame these things on climate change, or are they just really pronounced events that may happen from time to time anyway? So, Will, great to have you back, mate, and thank you so much for teasing out a really complex area in a short space of time last session. So welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. So, we will dive straight into then this issue of the disaster dynamics. So, explain to us how climate change is affecting the world of disasters, particularly as we face them in Australia.
Sure. The link between climate change and disasters is more complicated than just a simple physical, scientific, we understand the physics and the chemistry. Therefore, we can understand how disasters might play out. And that's because what makes a disaster is how it affects people and communities. And so there's these three elements of risk, and I commend people to go to agencies like the Australian Climate Service, for example, who've been doing a great job, especially in the recent National Climate Risk Assessment, of trying to tease out these issues of how climate change translates into these, societal, economic, even health effects. Um, so the 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 way disasters manifest themselves in Australia mainly is through extreme weather events, tropical cyclones, floods, bushfires. Um, those are the kind of, and we've had recent examples just in the last few years of these kind of events, and they are not in and of themselves new. So when people say we've always had bushfires, floods, tropical cyclones, they're not wrong. That's true. Um, but humans have added a couple of elements. So on the physical side, the hazard side, so you might say when we talk about climate risk, we often talk about a hazard, and a hazard is the existence of a particular type of event that might affect you. And different regions, of course, have different hazard profiles. If you're living in Canberra, you're not so worried about coastal inundation.
That'd be a really serious disaster.
It'll be a really serious storm surge because you're 600 meters up. However, we do experience bushfires, and we've experienced even floods in Canberra. So the hazard profiles vary regionally, and of course they vary depending on where are. And so there's that hazard side, which is where's that side of the risk? Might you experience some of these events? But then there's exposure. Are there people living there in places that might experience a bushfire or a coastal storm surge? And then the final piece is that vulnerability piece. Well, okay, there are people there, but maybe they're living in tropical cyclone hardened houses, and the infrastructure in the place is very robust and able to withstand some of the impacts of some of these extreme events. So where the climate science comes in is understanding how climate change might modify those hazards. In some cases, it's relatively clear case. Others is not so straightforward to understand it. So I'll give you an example: heat waves. We've seen a number of examples of quite severe heat waves in recent years. They're not new. We've had them before, but now, because we've raised that baseline warming, a heat wave is going to be in a more, it's going to be hotter. It's going to be a hotter heat wave. It probably might last a bit longer, and it might affect a wider area. So that's a clear case where we're pretty sure that climate change has modified those. And again, I mentioned earlier that those heat waves occur in the ocean as well and can affect marine ecosystems. But the heat waves that affect people are the ones that occur on land. But that interacts with the way also that people have placed themselves and their infrastructure and their houses. Because again, in cities, a great example is we've paved a lot of surfaces that might have previously been vegetated. And so that increases the vulnerability to some of these kind of heat waves. And there are a number of studies that show you can mediate some of the effects of heat waves by just planting more vegetation.
Right. So, there's been some suggestion that, that you get the heating of the oceans leads to more severe storm systems and cyclones. Would you say that's accurate or?
Well, it should. And what we do see in some of the data, there's not so much that there's more storm systems. And in fact, if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology's data over the last few decades, we're actually seeing fewer tropical cyclones. And
Right.
there are, and from a physical perspective, the models again are developing to the point where they're better able to represent some of these processes, but it's not so implausible to think that we might. And there are some models of future warming in which you have fewer of the number of tropical cyclones. So the number doesn't quite capture all of the risk because sea level is rising. And it's rising at about a few centimeters, 4 to 5 centimeters a decade around Australia. And so if you're a coastal community or a low-lying piece of infrastructure, that in itself means that you have a lower threshold for a storm surge inundating your home or your road or your piece of infrastructure or your port. So that's where climate change comes in to modify some of these hazards. But it also, because a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, we can already see that rain, when it does come, often is in these very intense events. And that's kind of the effect that you expect from a warmer atmosphere, as we understand the physics of the atmosphere. So from that perspective, any given storm might have a much greater effect because sea level is rising. It may be dropping more rain more intensely over a longer period of time. And so for coastal communities, we've seen examples where they have experienced severe flooding from inland in addition to storm surge effects
Right, because they
from
talk
the
about,
ocean.
the 1 in 100 year flood, that 1 in 200 year floods, but we've been having those. It's seemingly like every 5 years, in some cases every 2 years. And so that would be a consequence of the climate change effect then.
Some of those statistics do show up. It's not easy because some of these types of events are quite variable and quite noisy in terms of trying to see a very clear trend. And so it's not always straightforward to say, oh, we can see that there's more floods, less floods, or more of certain types of events. So that's not always a straightforward thing, but some of the characteristics we can see intensifying in just the way that we would expect climate change to intensify them. It's not always straightforward because, again, floods are a great example. They don't just happen because there's a lot of rain. They also happen because we've channelized drainage systems we've created urban drainage systems that are not adequate to the task of capturing a huge amount of rain in a short period of time. So there's also this interaction with human systems that makes some of these extreme events that cause some of these disastrous impacts not just a simple matter of, oh, it's the physics of the atmosphere. It's also how all these interact with the landscape and interact in some ways, in many cases, with human alterations of that landscape. That makes it in some ways more complicated to deal with in a scientific sense, but it's also an opening for action. In other words, we can do some things. We can design. We can, enact, better planning regime, so we're not putting as many houses in vulnerable floodplain areas. We can design better urban stormwater systems. So there's a lot we can do, even though the natural system may be evolving in a way that produces more intense, let's say, rainfall events. Part of the way we can respond, and that's what we call adaptation, uh, trying to anticipate how these things might evolve in the future and being prepared for them, and having systems that are better able to handle them. And that, there's a whole range of different things you could do. Bushfires are another example of where, um, and I'll put up a map. This is a map that shows that since about 1950, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, that's a map of Australia, and the red areas are places where there's been a increase in the frequency of what we call fire weather days. And those are, when we say fire weather, we mean the meteorological conditions that are conducive to the start and spread of bushfires. It doesn't mean a fire will happen, but there's a higher risk of it. And warming contributes. Part of the reason we're seeing that increase is because of anthropogenic warming. That doesn't mean you will have a fire in any given place at any given time, but the risk is greater because, again, the fire, to the extent that you have fire, it also needs fuel. So, there's the whole issue of, is there dry? Has there been a growth of dry vegetation? And you, and is there a lot of vegetation on the ground? Is the canopy vegetation quite dry? Is it windy? Is it hot? So all these factors come together. But this is sort of a map of, you might say, a sort of hazard map showing that these are areas that have become more prone to dangerous bushfires. And that is attributable in part to anthropogenic climate change.
So if we look at that map and then we extrapolate that globally, one of the big challenges that I was being confronted with was the fact that we often share air assets from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere in our respective bushfire seasons, wildfire seasons. But increasingly, it's being suggested to me that those seasons are overlapping a lot more, and therefore the air assets from the northern hemisphere that we used to draw on, would not be as available right across the scope of a fire season, for example, which may have implications for perhaps having to have indigenous capabilities here. So, in terms of what we're seeing from climate change, is that a thing? Is it an overlap of our fire seasons?
That's right. What you can see is an increase in the length of the fire prone or fire seasons in both hemispheres. So you're quite right that the amount of time in which, let's say, U.S. or Canadian firefighters are available to come to Australia and help bushfire season here is likely to be a much shorter overlap because they're needed back in North America, and likewise for Australian firefighters who, again, have a long history of going and helping their counterparts in North America, would have less opportunities, less chances to be available to go help in those other zones. And it has another implication, which is that the amount of time that's available to carry out what's known as hazard reduction or fuel reduction burns um, is also reduced. So that also makes the challenge of managing fire uh, and reducing some of those risks also greater. So that's quite a significant challenge. And so again, that's something that as we go forward, and people who are planning, regional planners who are planning residential or industrial installations, or for example, energy infrastructure. Um, People who are now planning to install, we're going to need quite significantly more, for example, electrical power transmission lines as we build more distributed renewable energy resources. And so the risk, um, the risk of running those kind of assets and infrastructure through bushfire prone areas or places that are likely to become more bushfire prone in the future is something that planners, are starting to pay attention to.
Yeah, we saw that play out in my region, when we saw the scale of that fire in 2019 to 20. It was larger than anything we had seen on any part of the planet. They were bigger than the Amazon fires, the massive fires in California, anywhere else, all in the space of Eden Monero, effectively, where 1 million hectares, was going up, and it was burning from north to south and east to west. And not even in Aboriginal oral history did anything like that have a resonance. And it really challenged the redundancy arrangements for a lot of services. So Telstra, for example, would have, one node in one position, and then, this one's only, it's a good 130, 150 kilometers away. So it's okay. Well, we've got this, sort of catered for, but it all went up. And, the aspects here too, I see, of the energy system, and you look at some of these heat risk areas and the fire risk areas, in sort of rural and regional and remoter areas, as well as, around our populated areas. Perhaps looking at a more resilient distributed energy system where you have localized renewable energy with battery storage, makes you more robust in terms of when the grid goes down. And so, this is a question of how we plan around resilience and redundancy as well.
That's right. And different types of energy infrastructure have different risks, depending on where they are and what type. So wind turbines uh, have particular risk profiles. Solar farms have risk profiles. High voltage transmission lines also have risk profiles. And so I think one of the challenges going forward is understanding those risks and those capabilities, and understanding what kind of a future we're building them into. And I think that's been a challenge for many, for planners, for engineers, for example, who design. For example, engineers typically often design infrastructure to climatological conditions, and historically they've often used a history of climate, let's say rainfall or um, whatever the variable might be. They say, okay, let's look at the last 40 years. But as the climate system evolves under these human influences that I've described, we actually have to think about, well, what is that? What's that new context likely to be, and how is it likely to challenge systems that we're putting into place?
Right. So what we can say, what seems to be the conclusion from a lot of this, is that we're likely to see a continuing amplification of disaster scale and frequency into the future.
For some types of disaster, that seems to be the case. I think one of the challenging things about many of these types of disasters, floods in particular, are a particular challenge because they are characterized by considerable year-to-year variability. And even though I've described that there are likely to be plausible climate influences in their characteristics, because they're so variable, it's not easy to see the climate signal, you might say, in all that. And so for a period of time, possibly decades, the variability of those systems might still be the dominant characteristic that we have to deal with and plan for. And that's because of something that we refer to emergence times of some of these signals. For example, again, floods are a classic example, something that's highly variable. And so that doesn't mean there isn't a climate influence in there, but it may just mean that it's not yet readily detectable in all the sort of variability, statistical noise. And so that means if you're thinking about adaptation, your task for the next 10, 15, maybe 20 years may well be to simply plan around that variability because it may take some time for the climate signal to emerge. And it might take some time by the time you say it with certainty, oh, climate change caused this or that phenomenon. You may have to wait a long time. So you may need to act more quickly and not wait until you're absolutely certain climate change is the thing that caused this particular event. And usually it's more than one thing. When we look at these extreme events, even when you try to simulate them in a model, it's usually clear that it isn't just one thing that makes these sort of extreme weather events. They're usually a combination of, let's say, climate variability drivers like El Nino, southern oscillation, and anthropogenic warming, and other variability drivers, some of which we don't fully understand yet. So it's kind of you see all these movies where there's a man-made disaster of some sort. I think about that movie Deepwater Horizon, where the rig blew up in the Gulf. And it wasn't just one thing, right? There were a series of sort of seemingly small effects that all added up to a major disaster. And that's often true with some of these natural weather-related disasters. It's rarely just one thing.
Yep. The old butterfly effect writ large.
That's right. And so I think that there's a challenge in understanding some of those variability drivers. And again, that's an active area of climate research. There's also a task in terms of sort of being prepared for these kind of events and having infrastructure and emergency warning systems and homes, roads that are actually robust enough to respond. I was just looking at a paper recently that actually looked at in Australia trying to tabulate and synthesize the number of deaths from floods over more than 100 years, over like 150 years. It was fascinating because the number of deaths have actually gone down, in part because we do have better warning systems and some more robust infrastructure. So that is not a statement that climate change, that's not saying, oh, people will look at that and might say, oh, see, climate change isn't really a thing. Climate change is a thing, and it is influencing those systems. But we do have an opportunity to, create safer systems, have better warning systems, and get people out of the way and make people safer in the face of those kind of hazards. And so again, that's all part of that response.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that's. I think that's really the million-dollar question for us and planners and politicians who only think in terms of 3 year election cycles. And we've got to do a better job of planning forward for all of that. But speaking of going forward, and love to get your take on this, but in terms of what is the future, the likely trajectory of climate change, and is it doable to do anything about it? I was a fan of the Aaron Sorkin TV series Newsroom. We've had Jeff Daniels in it as the key sort of journalist anchor to the show. And he was interviewing this fictional character of Richard Westbrook, who was from the US EPA, Environment Protection Agency. And he was asking, Westbrook for a sort of an optimistic perspective on, what we could do about all this. And Westbrook's answer to that question was, and I quote him, if we face this problem head on, if we listen to our best scientists and act decisively and passionately, I still don't see any way we can survive. So it was not quite the optimistic answer that Jeff Daniels' character was looking for, and obviously a pretty pessimistic one. So what's your take?
well, I guess there's two parts to that. One is it's not easy to know exactly, obviously. I think Niels Bohr said prediction is difficult, especially when it's about the future. Um, so
2020 hindsight's much better.
that's right. And so it is difficult to know exactly what future. That's why, for example, syntheses like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will use a range of different scenarios to try to look at what the future is likely to look at. But just last week, or was it the week before last, one of the groups that feeds climate scenarios into IPCC syntheses released its sort of view of likely scenarios. And certainly we've known for quite some time that some of the very, very high scenarios that sometimes drive climate models that produce some severe effects, their view is that those very, very high emission scenarios are likely to be implausible for a range of technological reasons. And that's a relief. So that's a relief. That doesn't mean so we're looking at a most likely, if you had to say, future from the United Nations Environment Program releases a report yearly called the Emissions Gap Report. It sort of looks at where we are in terms of climate commitments. Different governments had their nationally determined contributions. Australia just recently updated its commitments. And looking at all those, well, if they're all enacted and acted upon, where are we actually headed? And most of them kind of put us in a space where we're probably in a warming scenario by the end of the century of 2.5 or so, 2.5 to 3 degrees. Now that's a much more optimistic view than the 4 to 5 degrees that we were thinking about a few years ago. So from that perspective, that is, people should be somewhat relieved, but they shouldn't think we're out of the woods quite yet, because even that 2.5 to 3 degrees also has effects. It also carries with it a number of physical risks, including things like sea level rise, greater warming, all the effects that I talked about, possibly not as extreme and severe as some of the earlier scenarios we're working to, but still significant. And again, interacting with how human societies and economies also evolve, right? So we're, you know, if bushfire risk likely to increase, especially across the south and southeast of Australia. It's increasing also in regions where communities are growing. Uh, and so that's the thing I think people have to think about, is that we are still facing warming and the risks that come along with it. Um, some of these other effects, like sea level rise, and and again, some of these effects, some of these, not easy to predict effects, but effects that you can see like flooding, and like the bushfires themselves. Where will they occur and when? Not so easy to predict, but we can predict where the risk is greatest. So I think we have a task, I think, to still reduce emissions as much as we can, as quickly as we can. But on the other side, it's also to be prepared because, again, it's a long-lasting set of effects. It's not easy to turn it around quickly, and of course, it's not clear what all of our physical effects are driven by global emissions. So that's every country in the world. We can see that neither we nor other countries have completely stopped the burning of fossil fuels or the use of some of these products, and that again that has a time scale as well, the technological, economic time scale. So for some time, we probably will be experiencing climate change, warming, and its impact, and and how it modifies these natural hazards that cause some of these disasters. So in the meantime, that's what we call adaptation, and being prepared for all that, recognizing that there are characteristic timescales over which these kind of effects evolve. And
Right.
again, even if we are successful, it'll take some time to see the benefits of that
Right.
mitigation.
So as they say in the classics, you're telling me there's a chance, Will.
There is. Look, I may be wrong. I'll say it right now. I'm an optimist, and I think we will. I think we will over time.
So, like, I think of these things
Solve this
these
problem.
days through the lens of my granddaughters, 5 and 2 years old, and you want to, not only a question of whether or not they're going to be surviving in a tougher world, or are they going to be surviving with a quality of life in that world. So, in terms of what we can actually do, there's obviously a lot of stuff going on in relation to the reduction of emissions, and we've got to obviously keep that effort going. What about in the carbon sequestration part of this story? Are there any promising signs you could do that in any kind of scale that would be meaningful?
It's there are a number of technologies. Well, there are a number of technological approaches, or what we sometimes call engineered approaches, to remove carbon dioxide from either an industrial source, like the smokestack of a coal-fired power station, or from the air itself. So the number of processes that, and most of the carbon uptake, the sequestration that we now practice, and we can, and there is a market for it. There's a market for carbon offsets, but overwhelmingly, it's in the form of vegetation
Right.
of some sort. So it's a biological. In other words, it's the oldest carbon sequestration technology on the planet, which is photosynthesis. And it's been around for 2.5 billion years, and we know it works. Um, and that's good. And I mentioned earlier that natural ecosystems are also absorbing some of the carbon dioxide that we've been emitting, and so that's helped slow some of the progress of some of the climate change impacts. So but again, if you say, I want to offset a bunch of emissions by creating, a tree plantation, well, that's there's two issues there that have to be managed. One is it's what we call an open system, so it can just as well give up carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as take it in. Of course, it does. Ecosystems again have that balance. There's respiration and decay that puts carbon dioxide. There's also vegetation growth that takes it up. But those systems over time do have a tendency to get a bit saturated. In other words, they get to a point where they're not taking up that much more carbon dioxide. But also they're vulnerable. Again, we talked about bushfires. And so those kind of systems do have some risks in terms of the risk of that sequestration being reversed by fire or drought. So that's a challenge. So can you plan things in such a way as to put those type of projects in places that where you can minimize and manage those risks? But also, if we try to scale them up, they also require quite a bit of land and water. And again, as we as our population grows and we may want to increase agricultural production, uh, that may bring land uses into conflict. And as we, for example, look at alternatives to transport fuels, we see just in the last few months, we've seen some of the vulnerabilities of fuel supply chains in terms of our transport system, which still overwhelmingly relies on petroleum-based fuels. Aviation, trucking are the farm equipment all rely on aviation fuel or diesel fuel, but people are looking for alternatives that don't create net emissions. So biofuels are an alternative that a lot of industries have been looking at. And again, that they're present and they are available, but at very, very small scales. But to increase that scale, of course, takes land. And so I think there's a challenge in sort of balancing and optimizing all of those factors. But I think that over time, our report said that over time, we'll probably have to increase some of these engineered approaches to taking up carbon dioxide and re-sequestering the carbon in a geological system.
Right. So in terms of what would need to be done to achieve the scale, it will have to be some kind of scheme related around geological capture, and we're not close to a scalable solution there.
There are a few projects around, but again, they would need to be scaled up significantly to, make a serious dent at the scale that we need. And again, there is a lot of really excellent research and development going on in universities and CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, on capturing carbon and again resequestering it either by injecting it into saline aquifers or uh, depleted oil and gas wells, or making minerals out of it, and even making products out of it. And there's some startup companies that are making really great strides in making an actual long-lasting product, like a brick, uh, out of carbon dioxide. But again, these are all really promising, and there's enormous amount of research and development and deployment going in. But again, it would need to be scaled up significantly.
One of the projects along those lines that we've discussed on the series has been in relation to the potential for creating biodiesel from the uses of either waste product, but in particular, one product that I was really enthused about for a while there a few years ago was algae, and how sucking in that carbon really accelerates the growth of the algae and increases the volume you can achieve in production of biodiesel fuel with a straight drop in type, which had no conversion or blending required, even though there's actually some blending along those lines going on now for Viva's refining production. So, there's some potential because that's obviously going to be a large scale demand. So,
and when you look at some of the infrastructure that's involved, much of it is quite long-lived infrastructure. I remember talking to some people in the trucking industry, the long haul tractor trailers, and I was struck by the investment and the amount of time that people in those industries expect that equipment to run, and it's decades in many cases. And so for industries like that, where the availability and technology for, say, electric or hydrogen trucks is still in early stages, industries like that, of course, are looking for those kind of drop-in solutions in the form of things like biodiesel. And so those are all promising. I think the big challenge is getting them to, scales that can make serious dents in our reliance on those geological
Yeah.
fuels and, of course, the emissions.
And the policy dimension of that is coming up with the incentivized basis for it, the policy regimes that can actually allow things like that to flourish, and the investors that need to take an interest in these things as well, and how we can create mechanisms for investment too. So it's very encouraging, Will, that we've bought more time, which we can do things and address things. And so I guess the takeouts from our conversation in these last two sessions has been, yeah, look, it's out there, it's happening. It's not completely understood yet in terms of particularly how we translate what's going on in disasters and relate them to climate change, but there's definitely an aspect of it that's increasing that frequency and intensity, and that there are solutions out there that we can continue to work on, and effectively, as humans who created a problem, we're humans who can solve it. So let's build some consensus around that. And I have often thought it's been strange in Australia. We've had this division politically in the past, whereas in places like Europe and the UK, it isn't really a partisan political thing. It's just about who can do it better. And that Margaret Thatcher was actually the first politician to sort of blow the whistle because she came from a science background.
I think that's right. And I think the things that we've discussed today and the things that, the comments that, I've made, I would say to any, if you put any politician in front of me of any political party, of any political persuasion anywhere along the spectrum, I would say, I don't think I'd say anything all that different to any of them. I think it's a message, and I think it's an understanding that I hope they all take to heart. I think they may approach it from their own different political philosophies, but I would hope that they all take the challenge seriously.
Yeah, the old precautionary principle that okay, what if I'm wrong? Well, what we've done is develop new industries effectively that are sustainable, not based on stuff that's going to run out. And if I'm right, then obviously we avoid a significant catastrophe to the planet and future generations. So,
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining in with me. I really appreciate having you, and I'll no doubt be getting you back again to talk more specifically. Well, I think we've laid a great platform for understanding the general subject matter, and then each of these things could be teased out over a lengthy conversation. So, and as events occur too, it will be great to get your perspective on them. So, thanks for being with us. We'll really appreciate it, mate, and appreciate your service to the nation in all those public institution roles that you have filled. It is the confrontational challenge of this nation and this continent. So that work has been greatly appreciated. So thanks very much, Will.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Well, thanks for being with us, everyone. I hope you got something out of that and understand a little bit better nature of the problem, nature of the challenge, nature of the solution. And we'll see you again next time on Frontlines and Faultlines. Cheers.